First, I wanted to thank the Tenement Museum for holding this talk because it's something in the last two and a half years that's become a big part of my life. There are more than 40,000 Chinese food restaurants in the U.S., and they're scattered throughout cities and small towns and pretty much everywhere. You can't go to a town that doesn't have a takeout restaurant now. And they are staffed by a labor force of recent immigrants, most of whom do not speak English, many of whom are undocumented, and they filter through these restaurants from hubs in New York and San Francisco and Chicago. And all of these workers have an immigration story that goes back to China and villages in Fujian province and Henan province. And I think it's important to look, for me, it was very important to look at the employment network and how it fits into this immigration picture as a whole. So I thought first I would talk a little bit about how I came to write this story, and then I would talk about how the restaurant network works and how it fits into Flushing and Sunset Park and Chinatown. So I lived in China for 6 years. I speak Mandarin. I was working as a journalist. And in 2014, after moving back to New York, a worker that I had met in China in a village called me. He was a dissident in the village. He called me and said, "I'm in the US. I'm coming to New York. I don't know anybody. Will you help me find a place to stay?" And at the time, I had just moved here. I had a vague idea of where Chinese people lived. I had no idea how you found a place to stay. I didn't know how you found a job if you didn't speak English. So I went to the woman that ran the local laundromat and asked her. And she said there are two important things. First, finding a place to stay is very important. You have to get a Chinese language newspaper and look in the classifieds. And the second thing, they're going to have to find a job, and if they don't have documentation, there are only certain jobs they can get. And she said, if you work in a laundromat, it's a great job. If you don't have papers, you can make about $1,000 to $1,500 a month. So that was my first sort of clue into this whole network of people and employment. And so my friend, when he got there, and I got newspapers and started looking at advertisements for housing. And there were ads for shared apartments, rooms in shared apartments with shared kitchens and shared bathrooms, apartments where you could rent a bed. You could get a bed for a night from anywhere from $10 to about $15. They called them family-style hostels. And so I got curious, and I found a hostel that would let me stay there, which was difficult because if you're an underground hostel with undocumented workers, you don't really want a blonde woman hanging out. And that's where I met my first restaurant worker. And the hostel was pretty impressive. There were two bedroom apartments. I think they probably each had about 15 beds in them. They had split the dining area and the living area into different rooms with curtains. And women got the room with the bathroom. And I met a woman who had just arrived from Henan province and was about to get in a van and go to work in a nail salon in upstate New York. A woman the human trafficker she'd paid had actually set her up to work in a nail salon, and she had hated it and quit and was finding a job in a restaurant. And then I met Leo. And Leo, I think I'll tell you a little bit about Leo because I think it's important to kind of compare all of these stories. Leo came from Henan province. His father was sick, didn't work, and didn't make very much money. Leo had probably a middle school education and had gone to 2 years of vocational school and worked in a factory in China and hated it. And his aunt in the US had said, "I will give you money to help you come here. You can make way more money. $1 is, at the time, probably about 7 renminbi. You can send money home. It'll be a much better situation for you." So Leo found an agency that for $12,000 would help him get a student visa for a school somewhere, and I've forgotten where it was, in the Midwest somewhere. And they took him for 2 weeks and gave him a training to pass his consulate interview, got him a student visa, and he came here and got picked up. Didn't go to the school, came straight to New York, got picked up by his aunt, and ended up sleeping on her bedroom floor. And Rain, the person that I ended up writing about for the New Yorker story, came from a part of China where it's much more difficult to get a U.S. visa because of the history of illegal immigration. And he paid $70,000 and ended up sneaking over the border with Mexico. So you get here. Leo got here and he was $12,000 in debt, which is pretty good. And Rain got here and was $70,000 in debt. And a lot of Chinese immigrants get here and know from past experience from their family network that if you're going to apply for asylum, you have to apply for asylum in the first year that you're here. And there's a network of Chinese lawyers that do this, and they cost about $10,000. So that's another $10,000 that you're in debt. And so all of a sudden, employment becomes, you don't have a place to stay, you don't speak English, you're in debt, you have to find a job. And that, Leo had a friend introduce him to restaurant work, and he was really the person that showed me how the network works. And also, I think it's important to note that the kinds of jobs that are available to Chinese immigrants has a history to it. Very early on, when Chinese people were immigrating to the U.S., they were working on railroads and doing all kinds of jobs. And in the late 1800s, American workers got upset about this. They're saying we're getting priced out by Chinese laborers. There's a lot of, in like 1877, there was a big riot in San Francisco where they targeted Chinese shops and workers. I think they killed 4 people. And then in 1882, there was the Chinese Exclusion Act, which limited how many immigrants could come over legally. And so after that, Chinese immigrants really, that's where Chinatowns came from. They really congealed into immigrant sort of ghettos and worked in industries that were not competitive with American laborers, and that included laundries and eventually nail salons and restaurants. And then later, when immigration policies had sort of loosened, and after 1989 and Tenement Square happened, there was a huge influx of immigrants, mostly from Fujian province, where Rain was from, and a lot of them did the same thing. They went and worked in restaurants, and then they took over. They became restaurant bosses, and they found that in places like New York, the competition for Chinese food restaurants was ridiculous. You couldn't make any money. It was impossible to open a restaurant. So sort of savvy, entrepreneurial Chinese immigrants started going further afield. And the problem is, while the demand is there and you can make money running a takeout place pretty much anywhere, the employees are not there. The network isn't there. You can't find a cook. So this is when the employment network that exists now started up. And how it functions for someone like Leo, how it functions today is most of the Chinese restaurant employment agencies are on Eldridge and Forsyth Street in Chinatown. I would say, I've never counted, but I would say there are about 30 of them. And to get a restaurant job, you want to probably Sunday and Monday are the best days to go, because restaurant bosses, the busiest days of the week if you're a restaurant boss, are Friday and Saturday, and they want you to get there before then, so you kind of adjust to what the work is like before the busiest days of the week. So if you go down to Eldridge and Forsyth on a Sunday or Monday, you'll see just kind of mobs of mostly Chinese men kind of hanging out on the sidewalk and waiting to see if a restaurant boss wants them. So Leo went down with me and took me to sort of show me the ropes. And what you do, all of the agencies are sort of pretty much narrow rooms with a desk and kind of bars separating the women that run the agency with the workers. And they have notebooks. And Leo would come in and say, here's my phone number. This is my experience. He actually was a sushi chef. One of the things that happened in the 1990s also with all of this increased competition is that a lot of Chinese people started taking over Japanese food restaurants because they figured they could charge a little more and make more money. And so Rain was a sushi chef, and which is it's a better job. Or Leo was a sushi chef. It's a better job. And so you leave your phone number, you write down what your expertise is, and if that agency has a boss call them that day, they'll call you, and you'll talk to the boss, and you'll go back, and you'll get a slip of paper that says your name, the boss's name, the area code of where the restaurant is, and the bus agency that you're going to use to get there. But so you don't ever really know the name of the restaurant or really the town that you're going to unless you ask and check it out. And the employment agency will charge about $25 for this. And so it kind of shows you that there's a lot of turnover, there's a lot of transients, if 30 of these places can exist in Chinatown. on $25 a pop. And then you go and you get on the bus in about 24 hours and you go down to wherever. I followed Leo Leo, when I first met him, went to Doylestown, Pennsylvania. And most of the time you live in housing that the restaurant owner organizes for you. So he was in like a little suburban clapboard house.
The same with the nail salons. So.
Yeah. And it's so there's a kind of a hierarchy of what is a desirable restaurant job. Both Leo and Rain were pretty desirable cooks. Rain was a really good cook, and Leo did this sort of specialty. And they expected to get about $2,500 to $3,000 a month. And if you get paid more the farther you go. So in New York, it's much more competitive. People want to be in New York. Their family is in New York. Their relatives are in New York. And they don't speak English, so how are they can't really function outside of the Chinese immigrant areas. And you kind of have a lot more bargaining power the further you go because it's harder to get an employee. So you can leave. That is your trump card. You can leave on a Friday night, and that restaurant boss is going to be very upset. It's going to be a really hard time. There are certain advantages to going further afield, but the disadvantage is that you live in these clapboard houses with people that are not your friends. People don't really. I've seen some restaurants where there's kind of camaraderie, but for the most part, people do not make friends. They go home at night and play on their computers and text their girlfriends. It's incredibly isolating, and you work long hours. You get one day off a week, and you can't really leave because you're in a suburban place. You don't drive and you don't speak English. So it's a really, really lonely job. And that's also why there's so much turnover. Rain and Leo would go for like max 3 months to a place and then come back for a week or two and see their friends and stay in these hostels. And it's really hard. And it's harder, I think, than people expect. And they don't, like Rain would never tell his family how hard his life was because they couldn't do anything. And they had spent all this money to send him to the U.S. And they don't want to tell their friends and neighbors that they'd done it for no reason. You want to have a successful immigrant in your family. It's a big source of pride. And so for Rain and for Leo, you're just sort of working for you're working for the future generation. You're thinking, well, my life is really hard and this is really hard, but my kid will have advantages. So I think for a lot of restaurant workers, that is the dream, that becomes the dream. It's very disappointing when you first get here, but you've spent so much money, you can't go back. And I think a lot of people measure success by how people in their home village view them. So in Rain's home village, people have sent money back to build huge villas. So you may live a very small life in New York because it's New York and everything's expensive, but you're still making, I don't know what the exchange rate is, like 6 or 7 renminbi on the dollar, and your village is very cheap, so you can build your parents a really nice house. And when your kids get old enough, probably your parents will take care of your kids in China until they're old enough, and then they'll come back and go to school in the U.S.
I think living for the next generation is an absolute theme I found in my story as well. And I'll briefly say, if I can, how I found mine, which actually really resonates with yours. It's just this happenstance. This guy happened to call you, which I think is extraordinary that you had the nose to follow that. Anyone else could have helped the guy out and, walked away. But I think that's amazing. And I found the story because I found a woman living, essentially existing, living just for that next generation. And that's the point that really my reporting underscored for me, that it's really just an existence. You say making a living implies they're doing living. And I actually found the story on my birthday about 5 years ago. I treated myself to a pedicure at one of these sort of Vogue's top secret best bets. It's got like on the wall, like fashionistas, come to this place. It was a 24-hour salon in Koreatown. And I, very unusual, obviously, 24-hour salon, whoever heard of such a thing. I went there, I'm getting my pedicure, and I said to the woman, it's so crazy, this is 24 hours, like, who works the night shift? And she said, I work the night shift. And I said, it's 10:15. What do you mean? And she said, oh, I work the day shift too. I said, I'm sorry, what? And she said, I work 24 hours a day, 6 days a week. I sleep in a barracks above the salon. And when people come in for night treatments, they shake me awake. And I come down to do treatments. And then I go back upstairs to bed. And on the 7th day, I go home to my bedsit apartment in Flushing, probably what you were describing. And I sleep for 24 hours, and I come right back. And I really had this moment. I've literally told that story so many times, and if you could come up here, you'd see the goosebumps. That's still, it just sort of, it was one of those head-snapping moments. And I just thought, this woman is enslaved. And I pitched it to my boss at the time, and she said, you're a freelancer, because I was a freelancer at the time. She said, you can't afford to do the story right, because to do the story, as both of our stories, you have to embed. You have to spend a significant amount of time. You have to sleep in that. Hostel is a considerate word. I've been to many, many of those. I think hostel, conjures backpacking in Europe. They're filthy. They're frightening places, especially for people who let their guard down and sleep there at night. I'm very impressed that you did. And she said, you can't do the story because you have to embed. And then when I was a staff reporter about 4 years later, I pitched a story on that salon. They just sort of a call, does anybody an investigation idea? My bosses said, why don't you take a month and see if that story is bigger than just that story? So I hired a bunch of translators in Korean, Chinese, and Spanish, and we read the clips from the ethnic press in New York, which is incredibly voracious, hungry press, and actually really speaks to, I don't know if anybody's a journalism fiend like I assume we are, but it really speaks to the importance of having a robust journalistic market, because they fight each other tooth and nail for every single scoop. So they cover even incremental stuff. So in translating them, I found dozens and dozens of stories of abuses to happen to manicurists of every sort, lawsuits that other papers had overlooked, of manicurists being paid dollars an hour. And I put them together in a package, and I said, I think I found more. And then I spent the year essentially, you described the Forsyth Corner as filled with workers. There are many corners in Flushing that are filled with manicurists, actually waiting almost like migrant workers to be picked up and taken in buses. Often these women do know where, but they don't really have an idea spatially of where they are. So you say, Connecticut, where's that? Well, like hour and a half away. And they stay at these places. Often they pay the bosses for food and board. They are paid slightly more sometimes when they're further afield. I thought that was interesting that you mentioned that, but not always. And also, having spent all these, every morning we'd show up at these pickup spots. I probably approached, 300 to 400 people asking if they'd speak with me at those spots every morning for several months. I ended up getting 125 women speak to me, roughly, and then plus 100 more other sources. Through that, I uncovered that it's also not just predicated on wage exploitation, which is why the price of a manicure in New York, I did surveys, is half the price of a manicure countrywide. It's $10.50. The price of a manicure outside of this city is $22 something. And everybody always comes and you're nodding, and everybody's always shocked. Like, I want to go to New York and get one of those cheap manicures. Like, why in the most expensive city in the country?
Everything else is more expensive in New York because rents are so high.
Well, exactly. Right? So, suddenly you realize it's falsely depressed. But not just that's happening. That based on what race you are, you get paid differently in the nail salon industry, which was extraordinary to me. And then, they would tell each other there are different levels of job in the nail salon industry: big job, middle job, and little job. And big job is sort of working with acrylic sculpturing. And I started hearing that older women would say, you can make much more money doing big job, but older women tell young women not to do it. And you'd think, these are young women who have families to provide for. Why are the older women telling them not to do it? And they say, oh, we don't want her to have, a baby with problems. And you're like, what? And so it's sort of a known thing. And then I started trying to dig into why this isn't. And you can't make sort of these sweeping statements that maybe these women would. But then you find out the European Union has banned 1,300 chemicals, cosmetic chemicals, and America's banned 11. And so these women are surrounded by chemicals that are linked to the very things they're finding, sort of incidentally or what's the word, anecdotally among them. And so that was a really interesting side of the story that I really didn't expect to discover at all.
So we're very fortunate to have Lauren and Sarah, who wrote, really extraordinary stories.
And fortunate to have Steve. Can we just get this guy's a legend.
Thank you. Thank you. So since I'm the oldest person in the room, perhaps, I'm going to talk about history for a second or two. So I started writing about labor for the New York Times in the mid-1990s, and the immigrant workforce was not a very big issue then. The economy was booming under Bill Clinton, despite his tax increase. And then, in the late 90s, there really was a huge inflow of immigrants from Mexico. I remember I wrote a lead story for the New York Times for Labor Day. It was Labor Day 1999 or 2000, saying there's a huge surge in immigrant workforce. It's the highest. Immigrants represent the highest percentage of the workforce since the 1920s, and people are really waking up. And so they're immigrants. Going back into American history, as Lauren was saying, immigrants were always the most exploited people in the workforce. Chinese laborers on the railroad, Jewish, Italian sweatshop workers. For a while, Puerto Ricans were the most exploited. You mentioned Eldridge and Forsyth. Probably 100, 110, 120 years ago, there were probably shape-ups for Jewish and Italian garment workers right there in the same spot. So now there are shape-ups for Chinese restaurant workers. So in the late 1990s, 2000s, the whole issue of immigrant workers became much bigger. I mean, they became a much larger percentage of the workforce. And I think what's great about what Sarah and Lauren did is they really took extraordinary deep dives to look at some of the most exploited workers in the United States of America. And one thing I thought was great about both stories is they looked at industries that so many of us take for granted. How many of us eat Chinese food? How many of us, not me, go to nail salons? But you look at the nail salon boom in New York over the last 10, 15 years. It's like, what's going on? And it was great that Sarah was smart enough to see what's going on. Something weird is going on, and it's being done on the backs of these arguably exploited workers. So the title for tonight's panel is, the American Dream. So I wanted to ask both of you. You wrote about, focused on someone named Rain. You focused on someone named Ren. Do you feel they came very much with their eyes open about the American Dream? Do you think they were pursuing a fake American dream, and how is it working out for them?
Sure. What was really interesting is that the manicure profession used to be a very an excellent catapult into small business ownership. You used to work real hard, and you could save up, and you could end up being a salon owner. And it was an excellent inroad into becoming an active member of the city and of the economy. What's happened with the wages and prices not having gone up since the 90s, that now is misleading. So whereas people like Jing or Jing's family or other people may have heard that this is the route in and the route up, it no longer can be because of the level of what these women are, I'd say, being paid but not being paid.
I think that most people that I know in Chinatown and in Flushing had a false idea of what the U.S. would be like. And it's perpetuated, self-perpetuated, because they're sending money back and building these villas and saying, look, I've been this huge success in the U.S., people still want to come. So someone like Rain he said, well, my opportunities are not that great in the U.S. I'm not very well educated. I can work in a factory for less money. And these villas are going up in my village, and I can do that. I can go and make this much money. And then nobody tells you how hard you have to work and that it will take you, 30 or 40.
In a sense, he's engaged in false advertising. Feels exploited, works very hard, only gets to see his girlfriend every few weekends, and he's not very happy. He leads a fairly miserable, solitary existence, but what people back home are seeing are, he has enough money to build a mansion, so it's, and I guess they're too scared to tell the truth. And
actually, I know from his village, I know a restaurant boss who has gone back and built a villa for her parents in a village. She has like 3 villas. And after we did the story when we were doing the story for the New Yorker, she had agreed temporarily to let us photograph her in her restaurant. So we went and photographed them working, and afterwards she called me and she said, don't use those photos. I've gotten too concerned that it'll get translated into Chinese, it'll be sent back to my people in my village will see what my working conditions actually are like, and I don't want them to.
So I'm going to ask both of you about responses to your articles. I think Sarah got someone named Andrew Cuomo all up in arms to really investigate the industry very much. Before I ask you about the response to your article, so did your article get much of a response? Was there any crackdown on the employment agencies, more investigations of Chinese restaurants?
I did get contacted by some law enforcement agents in Chicago who were interested in cracking down, but They wanted me to share information with them, and that wasn't really the aim of my article, and I said no.
So Sarah, I wanted to ask you about, right after your article came out, Governor Cuomo was up there, with a press conference. How did that feel, and can you talk about how that played out?
Yeah, that was incredibly interesting. The governor pushed through emergency regulations with a couple different facets were eventually written into law. A couple of them changed the life for manicurists, I believe, in very valuable and instrumental ways. One of the main ways in which these women were being exploited was when they first start in the job. So this little job, or they might call it trainee, but it's a misnomer in the industry. It's not a trainee. It's not an intern. It is simply you're working for free, like Jing Ren in my story, who worked for almost 3 months for unpaid, or you have to pay the owner for the privilege of working there unpaid. And the owners frequently say, we're doing the workers a big favor. They're unskilled, they don't speak English, and we're giving them this opportunity. And that may be the case, but it's illegal. And so the law started a trainee status for workers. So it might sound, we're deep in the weeds here of technical stuff, but that really is... it can be hugely life-changing because it gives these women agency, whereas before the owner could say, look, you're not supposed to be here anyway. You don't have a license. They say, well, now there's a trainee status in the licensing program. So that will be a big deal for them. It also, one of the really interesting things that happens is when nail salons are found to have underpaid their workers by a court of law, they have to pay money to them. They close up. And they close up in such a very specific way, actually. A lot of labor lawyers I spoke to think it's taught from salon to salon as the way of doing business. They sell it quickly to someone for a couple bucks and hide the place. So there's also a wage bond requirement, which is a type of insurance that will prevent against owners from doing this. So that even in the event you're found to have defrauded your workers, you still have to pay. And actually, when you talk about pushback, or when you talk about response, that has, in recent months, as the deadline has come, created a tremendous pushback, and by people who are very irritated that some good owners will have to also purchase this type of insurance, and there has been a tremendous outcry that the governor's law is too sweeping. And yet, when in the task force that was also created in response to the law, along with a second task force, which is the Exploited Workers Task Force, which will look at other industries, which will hit on your guys, I imagine, they've found so far that 43% of salons they've inspected don't pay minimum wage. 87% of salons the government inspected don't keep payroll records at all. So they're relying on essentially testimony from workers who are terrified to tell them about the pay they're getting. And so it's very interesting to see the idea that is being presented now in people pushing back or retaliating against the story, that it's somehow not widespread when the task force every day shows how deeply entrenched and widespread it is.
So can either of you talk about, looking back 10, 20, 30 years, I know the nail salon industry hasn't been around in force that much in New York, but can you compare how immigrant workers are treated now compared with 10, 20, 30 years ago in New York, in the New York area?
The way I can speak to that is that a lot of the restaurant bosses that Rain and Leo and everyone I know work for started out. I don't know if this may not be true in nail salons, but they started out as restaurant workers, and they really feel there's a certain amount of I did this, and I worked this hard, and it's still so competitive. I'm still so stressed out. I still work 12-hour days. You have to do it too.
I'm rereading this wonderful book about this horrible event in history, the Triangle Fire, this extraordinary book written by David Von Drehl, and he talks about how the two founders of the company, Blank and Harris, they started as garment workers, and then they built up the largest apparel manufacturing company in New York.
Yeah, I think it's also worth. I think there's kind of this avenue of what the steps you take to how you climb as an immigrant worker, and most people, like most restaurant workers, their goal is to eventually be a restaurant boss. Like they don't think about doing anything else. It's just that is what they know, and that is what people did before them did, and that is what they plan to do.
I remember years ago I went out with a New York State task force and flew back a few blocks south of here in Chinatown one Friday night visiting some Chinese garment sweatshops. And a lot of us were writing about wage theft, minimum wage violations, overtime violations 15, 20 years ago. I just wanted to ask you, why do you think wage theft remains so prevalent in your industry, in the industries you wrote about in other industries?
I'm actually sort of curious how you regulate this out of existence, because and I don't know. I'd be interested in finding out the answer, because so many of the workers are undocumented. So many of the workers don't speak English. My friend that originally got me into this, his wife actually worked as a nail salon person for like 2 or 3 months. She put $100 down. She got it back when she left.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I've never heard of that.
It was just a guarantee that she would stay there for 3 months.
Wow.
And she actually ended up sort of going on to do better, higher paying jobs. I've lost my train of thought.
Why it still happens, how to regulate it away.
Right, and so for her, when she first got here, she was on a tourist visa. She was basically undocumented, and she actually went to the local barber. She didn't know anyone, so she walked into the local barber and was like, I have no papers. What can I do to make money? And he said, you work in a nail salon. And I don't know how. And also there are predatory bosses in the restaurant industry that take people that they know that have no experience, and they don't plan on keeping you for very long, and they just work you to the bone, and they don't give you any training. They give you everything they haven't done in the last year and just make you do it and never sleep. And then they know that you'll leave and they won't have to pay you that much. But you're undocumented, it's your first job. How do you avoid that?
Sorry. That would have been exactly my answer. I think that there is a sense that it's the job they can get, and I think that it creates a big difficulty. With my story, and actually this applies to yours, a lot of the response was so strong because the consumer felt really culpable. And I think there's this interesting component to my story, which academicians call manicures intimate labor. And I think that's a really interesting way to look at it, that here we are holding these women's hands and looking into their eyes, and I think the story revealed we don't really see them. And I think that's why it had such a profound effect. And I think that perhaps an answer to it is paying more for stuff. If the price is falsely depressed, whether it's H&M clothes or, not to diss H&M, I don't know how their business practice. Let me take that away. Cheap clothes, or cheap nails. That I think a possible solution, though I'm not an advocate, I don't, offer a solution, but something that many people have said to me is the price should go up. It's falsely depressed, and as one labor lawyer said to me. That whenever you get a discount like this, someone is bearing the cost of that discount. And in the nail salon, it's the worker.
So, Lauren, when I read your story, one question I had, and this will tie into perhaps a way to regulate it, is so Rain was making, the chef you focused on was making $2,800 a month. My sense is all off the books. And couldn't the government begin to investigate, like, this restaurant has 3 employees, they're not withholding any taxes?
Right. That is true, but then, and Rain actually has a Social Security number now, and so he could work. But so a part of the reason he was getting paid more. But for someone like Rain, before when he didn't have a Social Security number, how does that help you, or does that just? Does it just take away your opportunity to work? So again, when I was writing about sweatshops, and there's not much of the apparel industry left in New York City now because so much of it has moved to China and Bangladesh and Vietnam. But 15 years ago, when we still had somewhat of an apparel industry, there were tiny pockets, but very little. So you'd go investigate, you look into whether they were paying overtime, whether they were paying minimum wage, and you discover they have 2 very sophisticated sets of books. Good books and bad books. Yeah. And they have this one elaborate set that looked totally legal, that when the state inspectors came, they'd show that, no one worked more than 8 hours a day, or no one worked more than 8.5 hours a day. Then there's the real books showing that everyone was working 11 or 12 hours. And I remember when I went out with the state investigators one day, it was like 11 at night, and you look, because they all, the fake books say everyone goes home at 6, 7 o'clock. So we went out with them late at night, and then you check that against the books. So, so let me ask, what do you think the state, the city, the federal government should be doing in terms of increased regulation? Can it do much? I'm not entirely sure, but I did want to mention that I think one interesting thing about at least the Chinese community is that it's very insular. They're very mistrustful of state regulation. They don't speak English. They don't. They're not their best advocates necessarily. They're buying into this system, and they don't. It makes you nervous. It makes them nervous that regulators are coming in and sniffing around.
They prefer to be exploited than to be exported, deported. Yes.
Yes.
I think I have a similar answer. It's very interesting to me that in the nail salon industry, good books and bad books are the correct ones, because they're called bad because you lose money, and the good books are the ones where you make money. But I think if the resistance to the facts of the story that are happening right now in New York City show anything, it's that that prefer not to be regulated. Some of the demands in what the people actually were protesting outside the New York Times, and some of the demands were, we want to stay this way. We're giving people jobs, and I think the government's answer is you still have to pay them. Yeah.
You find this in the Chinese community with human traffickers as well. There's a very famous woman named Sister Ping, and when I was reporting the story, she died, and I went to her funeral, and people love her. They love her, and it's so funny because they're like, well, you paid her massive amounts of money to be shipped on, and in the 90s they were taking like rickety boats. The famous one that sank is called the Golden Venture. Why do you love this woman? She didn't do it out of the goodness of her heart. You were paying her you were giving her everything you had. But still, for them, they're like, well, it got me to the U.S. and it got me my start.
So, Sarah, you mentioned these protests by some of the salon owners, and they've criticized you for this or that. In your story, they say you painted.
They torn up pictures of my face too.
Right. They said you painted everyone with a bad brush. Not a good brush. No. And so I wanted to ask, give you a chance to respond to these criticisms.
I think I already addressed that. I think that the task force results, rarely when you investigate private industry do you have an opportunity to have numerical and independent corroboration. You can do that with government when you investigate government because you can do what's called a freedom of information request, and you can get data from them that the law requires them to hand over, even if it makes them look bad. But you can't do that with private industry. And this is the rare story that has independent corroboration because of these task force findings. The task force is a group of different agencies. You asked about the tax issue. It includes Department of Tax. It includes sorry, I'm getting the name wrong. Tax and Finance. What is it? Yeah, everyone knows that guy. Includes Workman's Comp, includes the State Department, which does things like licensing, includes the Health Department, and includes the Labor Department. And they all go out all together, and they've been going out to thousands of salons and been finding exceptional numbers of violations, both fiddly little things like licensing issues, but really dramatic numbers that almost would qualify my story's findings as an understatement. I think I've addressed it, but more than that, this is the rare private industry investigation that has independent corroboration.
One word that has not yet come up in the conversation is union, and Lower East Side has a great history of labor unions. Samuel Gompers, the founder, first head of the American Federation of Labor, was a teenage cigar roller maker just a few blocks from here. Eldridge Street? I forget. Ludlow, Eldridge, I forget. Ludlow. I'm sure some people in the audience are wondering, can unions help at all in this context, or are these workers kind of too many or undocumented? They're too scared of dealing with institutions?
The workers I interviewed, the vast majority were undocumented and would be really too intimidated to coalesce. I think, again, back to the pushback, you haven't heard from the workers in any of the pushback. They've been erased, and that's because they are voiceless by the nature of their position in this society. And so I don't think they could unionize. I even had one worker who didn't make the final cut into my story, but she does have a green card. And when she calls and asks for jobs, she pretends she doesn't, because owners won't hire someone with a green card because they're afraid that they'll know their rights more.
The same is true for restaurants. And also, a lot of the people I talked to that did have green cards applied for asylum. And a lot of, at least in the Chinese community, nobody really knows how many, but there are a lot of false asylum claims. You'll sort of hear the same story over and over again. And people are very nervous about that as well.
I'm just thinking out loud, thinking to myself as you talk. So, car washes, largely undocumented workforce, hugely exploited also. Yet we're seeing a dozen car washes in New York get unionized now. And I'm just wondering, why, partly because the union said, well, let's try to unionize this group rather than nail salons. But I'm just wondering if there's something about car washes that makes them easier to unionize. Most of the car wash workers are Hispanic, a few Haitian, a lot more male.
Actually, that plays into this, because one thing that I've been told over and over is that a large proportion of the women in my story were Chinese. It wasn't about Chinese restaurants. It was Korean and Chinese. And something many of them have told me is that coming from countries with a history of communism, they have a lot more anxiety about the interplay with government and even the press, because the press is a state apparatus there. So this was super interesting, and actually two of my translators are in the audience. Go girls. We found that when we approached workers on this street corner, a lot of the Spanish-speaking workers understood much more readily what we were about in terms of journalism and newspapers, and a lot of the Chinese workers, because the street corners are mostly Chinese, really backed off much more, and that was eventually explained to us when we did establish these relationships with them, that it was really that in their home countries, the press is something to be feared. They don't have the same values.
I think I'm not sure if that's because they come from communist countries, or I'm not sure why that is, but the Chinese community is very, very wary of outsiders coming in. It would be really hard to unionize them, and
I've interviewed some Eastern European workers around the United States, who had been in Czechoslovakia, who had been in Hungary, who had been in Romania, and they are much more resistant to unions because they grew up with these horrible, repressive, unions that were that were tied hand in hand with the government, and they really don't come open-minded. And folks from Venezuela, Colombia, Mexico, a lot of them are much more open-minded. Some of them have real leftist backgrounds and are really open to unions.
Yeah. I also found, at least among the restaurant workers I talked to, there wasn't I expected there to be more of a sense of community, especially because you're living in these such close quarters, but you don't make friends. There's this feeling that there is this limited sort of piece of pie, and everyone's sort of competing with you to get it.
That's such a great point, because I actually went into these nail salons thinking that they were a little bit like barber shops, like this sort of sorority of women kind of, I thought they would all be like, girl power, sisterhood, and they loathe each other. And they loathe each other because of this piece of pie thing, but also because of, I realized much later on in the story, because of the racial disparity. So a Hispanic or a Latina worker will always be first draft to do a particularly gruesome pedicure, or a habitually bad tipper. She'll always be the one sent there because of this concept that pervades the industry that they're slow or dirt or unsanitary. And so, or a Nepalese worker who always have to eat in the basement while everyone else gets to eat at their desk. And these sound small, but these are these tiny indignities that really create these fissures in the workplace. And I almost feel so naive walking in thinking I was going to find, I thought I'd have a coffee with all of them around the table. Meanwhile, they loathe each other because they're pitted against each other. Another thing that's not typical but happens quite oftenly, sometimes, and women who get their nails done might know this, when a place will have a guarantee when you have a chipped nail, you can come back the next day, or something happens to your nail, you can come back, get it fixed. Well, very often when you do follow up with that guarantee and come back, the new worker who fixed your nail will get the tips from the original person. The owner will take it and give it to them. So again, there are these sort of poisonous atmospheres.
When I was reading your piece, I imagined, say, a nail salon with 9 workers, say 3 Koreans, 3 Chinese, and 3 Hispanics. And reading your piece, I had the sense that there was this real hierarchy, and the 3 Koreans would be friendly with each other, and they look down at the Chinese, and the Chinese would be friendly, and they look down at the Hispanics. So, these threesomes would be friendly with each other, but you're saying it was all cat eat dog.
Yeah, even between those. But also, interestingly, in New York City, Manhattan, pardon me, you'll see predominantly Korean salon workers. That's because actually the Chinese and Latina women can't get the good jobs in Manhattan. That's why actually standing at this street corner, this pickup spot, in the first couple months, I brought all the translators. I brought the Korean translators, Chinese translators, and Spanish translators. And I kept thinking, wow, my Korean translators suck at this. They can't find anyone, And then I realized that it's because they don't have to wait on the street corners for those jobs where they have to leave their family for a week or a month at a time, because they're the pick of the litter, and they get the more lucrative close-to-home jobs.
I'm interested, did you talk to any of nail salon bosses? There's a sense in the restaurant industry that the restaurant bosses were very harried. They were also working really long hours, and they were under enormous pressure, and also, sending money to support their families back in the U.S. and having to house these workers.
No, of course I talked to nail salon bosses, a very significant number of them, probably 3 dozen. And they had a very interesting perspective, which is reflected in my story. One in particular, with the name of Roger, he says, look, I'm giving this community a hand up. I'm bringing these people to dignity. And as he said that to me, the woman standing next to him was working unpaid in his salon. And a lot of them say, we feel cornered into paying cash. We want to be by the books, but we can't get workers if we pay cash. There are many rationales that they give for their behavior, and yet it doesn't stop it from being illegal.
So looking back at your pieces, is there something that you wish you had added that you didn't add? Was there anything that you wish that you had done differently? if you had an extra 200 words.
Yeah, I would have written about the men in the salon industry. I didn't write about it because my boss thought that, and rightly, that they were a little bit of a what's the word? Truncated? Is that a word? That sounds fancy. There aren't very many men in the nail salon industry. And that's because they won't hire them. The most desirable worker is a young, beautiful girl, to give this sense of pampering. And the men who do work in the industry have to go way far afield, and they have a sort of much more brutal experience. Their housing is much more filthy. They sleep in much more often these dormer situations. And they have a pretty hard time of it, because not every man wants to work in the restaurant industry.
The men that I know that have worked in nail salons, they do massages, and it's kind of like a humiliating job.
Or they're the driver. So there's actually a lot of wage cases in before the courts that the men drive these women to the salons from these pickup spots, and they get paid about $40 a day, and they sit all day long and wait to drive them back. So that's another aspect in which the men feel taken advantage of.
Yeah, there's a sense actually among restaurant workers that women have better opportunities than men, because good-looking women are more desirable as waitresses, and that's a place where you can sort of practice your English and get tips, and it's actually a much better job than being a cook, where you're in a hot kitchen working 12 hours a day.
There's a certain presidential candidate, I think, with some buildings named after him further uptown. And he has called for, expelling, deporting 11 million undocumented workers.
You all better learn to paint your nails.
Yeah. So, both these industries rely heavily on undocumented. What would happen if all these workers were deported? And do you see Americans ever doing jobs like these?
No.
No, and
I mean, all of our wash and fold laundries would be like there's so many industries that they've sort of run. There's so many conveniences, especially in New York, that we would lose.
Manicure work and beauty work is beautiful. It's intimate. Many of the women expressed that they really like making women feel better about themselves. One woman said this painful quotation that didn't make it into my story. She said, we're the women who make each single mom, each businesswoman beautiful and become invisible in the process. And it actually was a text message I got from this woman. I think, did you translate that one? Yeah, we were both like, oh my. I think American women would do it if it were compensated in the way, if it cost how much it really costs.
So going back into history, so right here on the Lower East Side, there was a very famous group 110 years ago called the Women's Trade Union League that was founded by some of New York's most famous society ladies, Mary Dreier. And there's the National Consumers League, which was really not a consumer organization so much as a pro-worker organization to try to stamp out child labor. And I'm wondering, have you seen, before your terrific stories came online, did you see any advocacy groups trying to help your groups of workers?
There are definitely advocacy groups in Chinatown. I think one of the things with Chinese immigration is that you get different sort of communities. The people that live in Chinatown tend to be kind of an older guard of immigration, so a lot of them will speak Cantonese. They'll be from Hong Kong or maybe Taiwan. And there are advocacy groups in Flushing as well, but it's not as cohesive. They're not as and I think originally when Chinese immigration was happening in New York, there were a lot of family systems, a lot of support networks that were in Chinatown that don't necessarily exist in Flushing or in Sunset Park, where the Fujianese immigrants live.
On the health front, there's some really excellent organizations working on behalf of the women. It started out of California, as most health things do, but spread to a bunch of different states and got a couple regulations on the books. A group called Asian Health Services out of Oakland did a random survey about what's your top concern for its patients and its people in the community, and everybody kept saying asthma and my eyes burn, and they thought that was really strange, and they went back and started to figure out what linked it, and it was the Vietnamese community there. They predominate in the nail salon industry, and so that really pushed a lot of buttons, and that was several years ago, and they have led the move to get some of the chemicals that are you can't say safer because they have a very sort of obtuse testing process in the United States. The chemical companies do their own testing. It's not like the FDA where there's an organization that independently tests things to make sure they're safe, healthy or safe. Cosmetic chemicals are tested only by the companies that put them in their products. And these people noticed this, and actually their sort of rabble-rousing got a lot of the big organizations to voluntarily remove what's called the toxic trio, these three particularly deleterious products from their cosmetics. But on the worker front, I actually had a lot of resistance when I started this. There's a group that specializes in Nepalese immigrants, or Nepalese, you get it. Neapolitan, no. And they had done a study of manicurists right before, and they showed it to me visually, and they wouldn't share it further. They wouldn't email me it, and I couldn't really wrap my head around it. And then it became clear that, again, we're talking about the status quo, that they were very frightened that these women, even though they were complaining vociferously, would lose their jobs. So you're up against that with immigrant groups when you're just trying to report a true story.
The last question before you open to the audience. So, in each of your stories, your stories, you focus on one, terrific character. And I wanted to ask you what has happened to your cook Rain, what has happened to your manicurist Ren.
Rain is still going. He's in Ohio now, and his girlfriend is still around. She comes back she works in New Jersey and is here every weekend.
And he comes back from Ohio every week or two?
He not everyone does this. He is very, but I think he's just very dedicated. He's a very dedicated boyfriend. He will take massively long bus rides to get back for just 2 days. So he'll sleep on the bus and then hang out with Annie for 2 days and then go back. And he'll do that. He'll try and do that once a month at least.
All of the women in my story are doing well. I didn't feel it was my place to be very intimately involved with them. I gave them the offer to reach out to me or any of my translators anytime. Though one, Jing Ren and Michelle Sun, they actually, a reader asked if they could get their email addresses. And I asked them, and I said, a reader would like to contact you. They said, okay. And he gave them both jobs. And Michelle, who has a passion for photography, and actually part of our photo shoots would always consist of the photographer teaching Michelle about the camera. So we'd shoot her, and then she'd be like, but hold on, what's an aperture? So she loves photography. So she's a photo stylist for a food blog now. And Jing Ren paints the nails of the women who work at the blog. Does she get paid
the minimum wage?
She gets paid more than the minimum wage. And Jing Ren, her cousin, the protagonist, is a manicurist for the women at the company. Her English isn't quite as good, so as she learns more English, they're going to give her more jobs. And one of the most beautiful things is I follow Michelle on Instagram. Her real name's Sun. And her Instagram used to be pictures of shadows on the ground, which were these pictures she'd photographed real quick before the bus picked her up and took her, the van picked her up and took her to this nail salon about an hour away. And that used to be the only time she had a free moment. And she almost, work was the totality of her life. And eventually she did some school. And now her Instagram is her just hanging out with her friends, or just chilling, and it's a marked difference, and it really has underscored that these women, as the current conditions are, just exist. They don't live, but thankfully Michelle is living a little bit now.
So finally, an upbeat note. So we'll stop there. So we'll take questions from the audience.
Microphone here.
I'm going to jump ahead and ask a question too while we're getting that set up. So.
a lot of times people define the American dream as something that you had mentioned earlier, the idea that people are going to come, they're going to work hard, they're not going to enjoy their lives, but the next generation will. And I guess, so a kind of follow-up question is, how are the children of manicurists doing? How are the children of Chinese restaurant workers doing? And I know it's early to tell, but like, what are the opportunities that these children are having? In other words, are they able to sacrifice their lives and ensure not just that back home the parents will have the villa and whatever, and then the next generation, what do you see there?
I think life is definitely easier for the next generation. I mean, it's really hard to say. I've met, I mean, there are a lot of really successful children of working class immigrants that are sort of my age now, or people that I've met that are in their 20s. But for people that I know and it's very hard to tell. I think that it'll still be, you're not going to get the second generation kid going to Harvard necessarily. Yeah, but I do think you're probably not going to follow in your parents' footsteps and work 12-hour days in a restaurant in North Carolina. You'll at least speak English and have sort of more opportunities.
I think it's a beautiful question and very important, especially my industry is all women, almost all women. And, I think it may have been true, again, in the 90s, in the early days of the nail salon industry, that this was a road up. But now, given that the prices are the same as in the 90s and the wages almost are, it's very, very challenging. There are these, in my story I spoke about these like little cottage industries that have arisen to help women raise children. So there's like these nannies that are sort of like Pied Pipers that go door to door manicurist houses and take their kids to school and bring them back. There's one woman who spends almost half her income for a person to take her newborn 6 days a week because she can't nurse at night and then go do the job as a manicurist. And there's another phenomenon which has been written about in the Times, and I don't think it was really linked. It was written about as like, this is this interesting thing that this community does, which is sending your kid back to China. And that we've written about it, that there's this tendency that you send about a little baby, maybe a year, back to the grandparents, and you bring them back when they're 5 for kindergarten. And the way the Times has written about it in the past is, isn't this interesting cultural phenomenon? And through my story, I realized it's a desperate move. Nobody wants to send their baby away ever. But when you're working all the time and have no money, you absolutely have to until they can enter the public school system.
I do want to say that's really common practice for workers within China as well. It's like really, and some of the villages in Fujian province that have been emptied out, you'll find old people and babies, and those will be the only people living in those villages. And people will also say they want to do that because they don't want their child to be just American. They want them to also have.
None of the women expressed that to me. They said, "I want to be with my kid."
So one of the favorite lines in your piece, Lauren, was your cook Rain says, everything we do for the next generation. No matter what, it beats, meaning working in the U.S., beats sitting around in the old village back in China.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting because I think if Rain had stayed back in his village, he wouldn't be making very much money, but he would have a much better quality of life. But the opportunities for his kid would be the same as they were for him. But then at the same time, Rain and Annie are not having kids because they can't take care of them. They have to work. They have huge debt.
But you said in a few years they plan to have kids.
That is yes.
If you'd like to ask a question, if you can come up to the microphone here.
Hello. I'm sitting with educators, but I don't work here. I've actually done a lot of work in the city around bicycles and bicycling. And one of the big backlashes that has happened as the bicycle network has expanded is a backlash against delivery cyclists. And all of the blame for bicyclist behavior is put on delivery cyclists. And when we started doing research into it, it was pretty clearly it's basically a workers' rights issue playing out in the sphere of transportation. So, people will be complaining about them riding the wrong way, but what we also found is that they're probably, underpaid and nobody's teaching them, and maybe the turnaround is really fast. I hadn't thought about that until you mentioned that they might only be working there for a week. So I guess my question is kind of knowing that, what is the best way to approach delivery cyclists and trying to improve behavior in the sense that it's really a safety issue for them where their lives are at risk potentially from traffic crashes and stuff like that.
Wait, if there are any journalists in the audience, that's a great story. That's phenomenal.
I've thought about this and written about this, so
Yeah.
Forgive me for opening my mouth. So, I wrote a big story a few years ago for the Times about all these bicycle delivery guys suing because they weren't paid the minimum wage. On the other hand, my wife was crossing the street, last year and almost had her leg taken off. I mean, a guy really was going the wrong way. She looked one way, and she almost had to go to the hospital. And I live on the Upper West Side. There are just so many bike riders. I used to, when I crossed on a one-way street, I would just look one way. Now, whenever I cross any street, I always look both ways because I realize there's going to, So I think the city should get more aggressive about bike riders going the wrong way, just as it should get more aggressive about all these jerks who are making turns very quickly when you're in the middle of the walkway. The latter is a harder issue to address. But I think if you as an individual, go up to the bike riders, A, they're probably not going to understand what you're saying. B, they might get mad at you. But if the police was to, say, crack down on them going wrong way, they'd have to spend an extra 2 or 3 minutes going around the block. They'll earn less money. So if that happens, something should be done to make sure they're making, a proper wage.
Well,
just as a
I was
follow-up.
going to just address your question. One of the Cuomo's regulations was that there has to be a workers' bill of rights in nail salons. I mean, maybe it would in different languages so that the workers all know you're not allowed to pay for your job or work for free. What if in every restaurant there was a traffic laws, in all different languages?
Yeah, there are.
Oh, well,
it exists. But
there
I
it
guess
goes.
the follow-up is if there is a police crackdown, and we're talking about undocumented immigrants, where do they stand in this potential for deportation or something? How do we protect them as undocumented immigrants?
Just have them obey the law when they're.
Yeah.
When they ride. So there are new regulations that they have to wear certain color vests with the name of their restaurant on them. So a little is being done, not enough. Yeah.
Yeah, I think going through the restaurants is the easiest way to do it without.
Yeah, I mean, if the bike rider is fined and the restaurant has to pay that creates incentives for the bike rider to the restaurant will make sure the bike rider won't break the law. So maybe if you fine the restaurant, that might stop the delivery guy from doing that.
Cool.
Sorry, I said guy, but they're all guys.
So I had a quick question about their desire to increase their quality of life maybe later on and potentially returning back to their home countries. When in the 90s I lived in the Washington, D.C. area, and there was a big culture of Filipino nannies there, and a lot of them, as they grew older, would try to save enough money to go home. In fact, most of them did. And that's a whole other story in itself, a lot of hardship depending on what kind of family they were in. Normally in America it was a pretty good story, but a lot of them had friends who that belonged to and no offense intended, but to Middle Eastern families in certain countries, the culture was very slave-like, and they would take their passports away. But anyway, the majority of them in Washington looked to return and would build their villa or have their family live in a villa that they were kind of building, and their families would live like kings and queens, and then they would eventually come home. So I was curious about the characters in your stories. Do they eventually see themselves when they get too old to work, potentially going back and saving for their kind of retirement at home? And then another side issue, which maybe shouldn't focus on, is some people felt it was very difficult to open bank accounts without proper documentation. So there becomes this whole cycle of saving money under the mattress, and that was a topic that often kind of came up.
There are actually ways in New York to open bank accounts. but yes, that is absolutely true. A lot of Chinese immigrants that I know, I don't know about Rain specifically, but Leo definitely wants to go. He wants to marry someone from his hometown. He wants to go back to his hometown. And I in Rain's village, there are a couple families that have retired and do like 50-50, and that's like the dream. They have their U.S. passports. They kind of have a little bit more freedom because of that, but they get to be back in their hometowns with their friends and family and sort of the culture that they're familiar with. I think that's huge in Flushing.
I think I spoke about this before, but I don't think that the numbers that we're talking about now in terms of the nail salon industry afford much ability to send money home or build your castle back home. But I didn't really ask people, are you intending to go home? So I would be speaking out of turn if I answered. Jing Ren, she's a little awkward. She's probably the hardest person to be a protagonist of a story because she's like a doe, she's sort of, and she really misses her friends. That's the hard thing, that they come here with lots of goals, but to be torn from your life is hard. Many of the people I spoke were all different ages, and it wasn't something I inquired, are you going back? But there's a lot of homesickness.
On banks for a second, yes, you can. Yes, low-income people can set up bank accounts, but the banks generally don't make them feel very welcome, and the fees, unless you have like at least $10,000 in an account, can be very high. And God forbid you have an overdraft that might cost $70, half a week's pay. So that's why we're seeing this huge growth of unbanked Americans and undocumented workers.
There are also a fair number of kind of underground banks in Chinatown. And it makes it a lot easier to send money back and forth.
All very honest and yeah.
Well, actually, one of the women that I think Julia and I spoke with, that's how she got her couch in her house. Right, Julia? I think so. But other people with one of those lending societies, these underground banks, everybody puts in, and then one person gets the bonanza at turn. But it wasn't that Nancy who also someone ran off with some of the money and caused a huge problem. And then also there was this story about arson in Chinatown. Where these two women were incinerated a couple years ago, and the reason why was because they maybe had taken some money or had money taken from them with one of these underground banks. So it's a dicey proposition. It's pretty dicey to be unbanked and undocumented in America.
More questions?
So I have one question. Are either of you, or the three of you, planning on looking at other industries that are sort of controlled by immigrants? I mean, I'm thinking about the Chinese massage parlors that are all over New York, or in Chinatown, all of the hair salons, $7 for a wash, shampoo, massage, and blow dry. So, I mean, the Chinese hair salons are mostly frequented by immigrants, but there are some that cater to other people.
I just want to make clear that
Don't tip your hand now, Sarah.
No. Well, the answer is yes. But I just want to make clear that my story didn't start out to investigate an immigrant-owned business. It started to investigate the nail salon industry, which seemed problematic. Only upon investigating did I find out the demographics behind who owned it. So, first of all, it's not immigrant-owned businesses that are problematic. It's problematic businesses that are problematic. That's the baseline here. But yes, the short answer is absolutely yes. Wherever there's a story, I think we'll both go.
Yes, I'm continuing to follow some of the people that I've met in Flushing, people that I knew in China that have come over, and I do know some owners of a massage parlor, and actually in terms of some of the women that I know, and talking about nail salons have said, well, it's a better option than massage parlors.
And actually, when your hands, some people are very reactive to the chemicals, and when your hands crack and blister too much from the nail salon chemicals, they're often pushed into massage work. And one of a really interesting labor advocate said to me, he talked about microforce and microcoercion, which will push people into the sex trade. So when you're doing massages, someone might say, well, Susie makes a lot more than you. And what that means is, we all know what that means. And so that it's a slippery slope into that.
Yeah, there are definitely some predatory massage parlors out there.
I would like to ask a question. So if you could choose between kind of the chicken or the egg situation of which one is worse for the problem of these immigrant workers who are struggling, if it would be the fact that it's so difficult to come for these poor immigrants to come to this country legally in the comparison to how it was 100 years ago, or even further than that for the quantity, or the fact that we're unwilling to pay unwilling to pay higher amounts of money for things that we've gotten very used to paying very low amounts of money, like clothes and manicures and pedicures. So
I think that the two are very entangled. I think if you came here with no debt, you would have a lot more options, and would not necessarily take the crappy nail salon job. But at the same time, if we paid more for nail salon jobs, a lot of people would be better off.
Yeah, well, a part of my story that I didn't touch on too deeply was the debts owed to snakeheads and coyotes for a lot of these women. We did it as a decision to protect their immigration status in order to use their stories because we didn't want to expose them. But almost without exception, especially in the Spanish-speaking community, they owed sometimes very significant money to people, which is hence why they had to be involved in these banking systems to pay it off. And then, there was definitely the specter of it, particularly in the Chinese community. But that actually plays into the anecdote I told about the woman who didn't want to say she had a green card because that would imply that she didn't have that kind of debt and therefore maybe wouldn't take such a low paid job. And so there's a level on which people are, you said this, exploiting the desperation of these workers, and the debts they owe play into that deeply.
Thank you so much for such an illuminating talk, and thank you, Stephen. Also, I think the perspective that you were able to bring, tying in the history as well, because there are so many connections between past and present. And thank you for the wonderful work that you did, and also for continuing to talk about it. And thank you for coming. And in 2 weeks, December 9th, I think it's 2 weeks, we have a wonderful panel discussing Andrzej Jezierska's classic book, Bread Givers, which came out in 1925 and told the story of a young immigrant girl, Jewish girl, trying to become American and the tensions that she dealt with. And we're kind of mixing it up because we have Alice Kessler Harris, who's a wonderful historian who discovered the book and got it republished in the 1970s. She's going to be here, but joining her is an amazing panelist of women today who've never read the book, but I asked them to read the book to see if it fit their communities and their ideas of feminism. So we have Anna Holmes, Nisha Agarwal, who's a commissioner of immigration for the mayor. We have Margaret Chin, who's the author of Sewing Women, and one more person. Linda Sarsour, who's the head of the Arab American Association of New York. So again, what we're going to do is look at a book that was classic, that was known for this tension between tradition and modernity and your old culture in America, and we're seeing if it still resonates for newer immigrant groups and new feminists. So please come and join us on that evening. We will also be having, this book has become so popular among ESOL teachers and students as well. So we'll have ESOL teachers and students in the audience. So please join us on December 9th for that program. And please join me most of all in thanking Stephen and Lauren and Sarah for this wonderful panel discussion.